Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA. The Catalyst webinar series is a bi-weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. We are very excited and honored and grateful and really, quite frankly, quite starstruck to have Craig Kessler, Director of Governmental Affairs for the Southern California Golf Association on this morning. Going to be talking about golf's political strategy for surviving the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Kessler, good morning. Thank you for being with us this morning. How are you?
Good morning, John. I'm fine. I know that in this incredibly fluid situation, just a personal note, I have this amazing inverse relationship with the game. When times are good and everyone has a smile on their face and is out playing golf and conducting championships and competing, and even yours truly is trying to hack his way around a golf course, my efforts recede into the background. It's only when we have critical problems, whether it's droughts, taxes, or in this case, a pandemic, suddenly governmental affairs moves to the forefront. So it's a good news, bad news sort of thing. The fact that I'm very flattered by you stating that you're starstruck, but that's not necessarily a good thing when that's the case. So, good morning, everybody. It's a bit of an ambitious title. I know it, Golf's Political Strategy for Surviving the COVID-19 Pandemic, but I'll do my best to bring you up to date on a very fluid situation as things break. And even I hope, inject a little bit of some perspective into it. So let's dive right in. When I accepted this invitation from John, I thought this would be the bulk, 40 minutes of this particular presentation, that we'd be in the middle of a hot 2020 legislative session in Sacramento, that I would be able to talk to you about all the progress we had made in taking last year's efforts regarding Assembly Bill 5, where we characterized our efforts as achieving a healthy measure of relief for PGA golf professionals, but we were going to perfect it in 2020. Well, that's not going to happen. The world has changed in the last 30 or so days, and it will continue to change for the next 130 days, in my opinion. So basically, this year's legislative session is, I would call it a lost year. Just like there's a lost PGA Tour, a lost baseball season, a lost golf season, a lost state amateur championship, a lost everything. Technically, the Assembly and Senate are both suspended until May 4th, although Kevin Fitzgerald and I were on call last Friday with the chair of the LA County Assembly delegation, who informed us that they're likely to come into session and then adjourn immediately to June 1st. And then all they're really going to do between June 1st and 15th is adopt a very skinny budget, because the budget that the governor produced was based upon, was before the world changed, and everything has now changed. We're going to be in the process of plowing very quickly through the $21 billion rainy day fund that the state has accumulated in the last, about 5 or 6 years, and then some. So they're going to put together a skinny budget and then spend the rest of the year tweaking it to deal with the economic detritus. And the other bills they're going to take up are going to be limited to COVID-19, economic relief, and all the permutations of that. They still have to deal with some consequences of wildfires. PG&E in the northern half of the state has gone bankrupt. They need to adopt some legislation to deal with that. And then what they've referred to as a handful of bills they've deemed absolutely exigent. I believe that AB 5 will be one of them, although if I had to predict, there will be no further progress on that than was being made just before the world changed and the pandemic shut everything down, which means that golf is not likely to be part of that this year. We'll have to wait till the 2021 session to move from a healthy measure of relief to something I would call a more perfect measure of relief. That doesn't mean we won't try. It just means I wouldn't get your hopes up. This should have been the period of time when everything was moving to committees and things were hot and heavy. A couple of weeks ago, we had planned to, or actually last week, we had planned a number of us to be in the Capitol traipsing around on visits, and of course what we were going to focus on was AB5. Well, the Capitol is shut down, and who knows when it opens up. I'm not sure it'll open up to the public in June. We'll see. That depends upon a pandemic curve, and there's some good news about that, particularly in the state of California in the last couple of days, but we don't want to get our hopes up too early. So that's pretty much it for the state of California, and that's a little sad, but it's a sign of the times. So what I'm going to do before I actually get to what I think is the strategy that the industry in California has begun to coalesce around in terms of how do we get golf reintroduced, how do we cope with this, and what do we do. I'm going to go over some specifics because I know there's a lot of confusion about the $2.2 trillion relief package that Congress passed a little over a week ago. There's two basic variety of bills. I know when I say this is a fluid situation, just this morning the Federal Reserve has released some information about developing another trillion or $2 trillion of liquidity through auspices directly through the federal system that will shore up business and make sure that we don't fall into a deep deflation. That's what they're trying to prevent here. This is quite an experiment. Throughout American history, we've had a lot of downturns, the Great Depression, the Great Recession, but this is the first time we've, in essence, voluntarily gone home and shut down all economic activity. The best estimates right now is that unemployment could peak at 25% before coming back down, and we'll get to a little bit of those economic projections later in the slideshow. But let me go over some specifics on the two varieties of relief. This one is directly to employees. And as you'll see, also perhaps persons who are self-employed and part-time workers and persons who are not ordinarily beneficiaries of unemployment insurance. I want to make clear that nothing about the congressional action changes the amount that individuals are eligible for in each of the 50 states. California is more generous than most, but generosity is not a word I would use to describe unemployment benefits. However, what the federal government has decided to do is to add $600 per week in addition to the state benefits, which run 26 weeks. These run 26 plus 13 and are independent of the state benefits. So it's a benefit over and above on top of it. I have a note here that they're scheduled to begin flowing within 2 weeks. They are now flowing in the states of New York and Illinois. I have no idea when it will begin flowing in the state of California. Keep in mind that the world changed for these institutions as well. California's EDD is not equipped to suddenly handle, on a national level, we now know, according to a press release this morning, that another 6.6 million have applied for unemployment in the United States on top of the 10 million who applied the 2 weeks prior. And that number is just going to keep going up and up. Well, there aren't enough employees in these employment development departments to handle all that. They're busy hiring persons, which is difficult because their offices, for the most part, are closed to the public. So I want to emphasize that on this particular program, the benefits are backdated to the date of unemployment, not the date of application, certainly not the date of receipt, because things are going to be later than they might ordinarily be. Now, Congress specifically provided for a number of individuals who are not normally covered by unemployment insurance. That's self-employed, temporary workers, part-time workers, contract workers, gig workers, and independent contractors. Now, there's some confusion as to whether the California portion will be available to those independent contractors who haven't either been paying into the system as LLCs or sole proprietorships, is a subject we all know very well because of the AB5 debate. However, if you were employed in a more traditional fashion as long ago as 18 months and were paying into the system then, it would appear that you're eligible. Now, I say it would appear because this has all been done in a slapdash manner on an emergency basis. and no rules have been adopted, no interpretations have been given, at least unless they have been given in the last 20 minutes, in which I didn't notice. So again, that word fluid will come up a lot in this discussion and probably every discussion you have. And that's why I put at the bottom, stay tuned for further refinements, definitions, and directions. This particular slide is not information that the SCGA has particularly put out, because we're the clubs and the facilities that we communicate with on a basis are of a slightly different variety, but I'm going to assume there are a lot of persons on this call in the section for whom this is of visceral interest. Now on, that was the simple stuff. Now on to the two tranches, the basic tranches before the Federal Reserve intervened today in a way I don't understand, and I don't think they understand yet. They're just making the commitment. I think that's a way of telling the markets that the federal government is not going to make perhaps the same mistake it made in 2009 by ending up not injecting enough liquidity into the system, keeping in mind that the threat of deflation is greater now than it was 11 and 12 years ago, because that was a financial panic caused by a certain imbalance, particularly in the real estate industry. This is not caused by any of the traditional imbalances that throw us into recession or great recessions, but is by the fact that we've all voluntarily withdrawn from economic activity. By the way, polling in California shows that 83% of the population supports stay at home. Keep that in mind when we get to some of the strategies about golf surviving in terms of reopening in this particular crisis. Paycheck Protection Program is the most generous and the main program. It's been funded so far at $349 billion. There's already talk in Washington, D.C. about adding $250 billion, maybe as early as tomorrow afternoon. I doubt it, probably go into next week. Eligibility is very important. It is for any profit-making corporations, ultimately less than 500 employees, and I'll get into a minute on how that's determined for management companies, because that in the golf industry in California, that's a big portion of our industry. But those nonprofit corporations that are eligible are just the 501c3, which are charitable nonprofits for which contributions thereto are tax deductible, and also C19s, which are veterans groups, which are simply a different category of 501c3s that are given special dispensation because of the role played by persons who put their lives on the line for the rest of us. Always get special consideration. And again, there's fewer than 500 employees. Not altogether clear exactly how that determination is made, because does that mean 500 in an LLC? How do you combine it? I'll get to that a little bit later. The key thing here is that 501c6s and 501c7 corporations are categorically excluded from the Paycheck Protection Program. Sevens are private country clubs in the state of California, are virtually all Class 7 corporations, non-charitable nonprofits of a specific variety. 501c6s are a little different variety, but for example, the section is a 501c6, and probably most PGA sections in the United States. The Southern California Golf Association is a C6, as are I believe every amateur association save 2 in the nation fit that category as well. So this is of great importance to those two organizations moving forward. The intent here was to subsidize small businesses so that they'll continue to pay employee salaries and other bills while their revenues are reduced by the current public health efforts. That's the total aim. That's why it's called paycheck protection. So there is a mechanism in place with incredibly enhanced unemployment benefits, which go to the issue of employees, and then this. In this program, there's no requirement to repay the loans if the money is used to pay employee wages and benefits, mortgage or rent, and utility bills. Instead, the loans will be forgiven after 8 weeks. Documentation, for obvious reasons, is required. Now, the loans are on a first-come, first-served basis. but $349 billion is not going to be nearly enough to cover the applicants or the need. And that's why Congress is talking about adding another $250 billion to the program. This is a little confusing, and those of you who are better at arithmetic than I am can maybe go through this and figure it out. But small businesses may receive 2.5 times their average monthly payroll, up to $10 million. Businesses do not have to show that they can repay the loan, but only that they were in business before February 15th, 2020. And then in this particular program, you have to apply from a participating bank. And that's already proved to be a problem because there are banks in the United States that don't want to participate. Other banks want to participate, but they need clarification as to exactly what they're getting into, and the federal government hasn't supplied it. So all of these things are works in progress. Obviously, the intent is good. In the execution, we'll see how well everything ends up being pulled together. Governments have a little struggle with these programs when they have 8, 10, 12, 16 months to put these programs together. Having 8, 10, 12 days to put them together is really a strain on their capabilities. Now, there is a second program. This program has received not nearly as much coverage or focus, and that includes from Gulf's organizations, and I'll get to that in a moment, at the national level. We've done it at the SCGA because we have a lot of C7 clubs that, as of now, are not included in the PPP. They are included in this particular program, and there's 10. And Congress, actually, it's an existing program, and it always and its eligibility is for private nonprofit organizations that are non-governmental agencies or entities that currently have an effective ruling letter from the IRS granting tax exemption under sections, all the C sections. That means the 6s and the 7s. That means, for example, the PGA section is eligible on this program, as is the SCGA, as are all the country clubs in the state of California. No cost to apply, no obligation to accept either. And that's a key point, because by the time the paperwork is done, to the degree to which maybe a lobbying effort in Washington can get the 6s and 7s included in the PPP, that is a much better route to go and much more generous. It's just for reasons I'll get to in a minute. I wouldn't count on that. We can hope for that, but hope is not a good strategy. What's in your hand is better to go. Up to $2 million can be borrowed, and no more than $25,000 can be secured. Now, the monies come directly from the U.S. Treasury, which I thought, until I read an item in the Wall Street Journal this morning, made it a program, an easier program to access than going through banks. But apparently not so, not thus far, which has caused a lot of members of the House and Senate to complain. And of course, they have some influence over the United States Treasury, so maybe that'll lubricate things and get the program moving. Now, the key thing here is that repayment is automatically deferred for 12 months. So that substantially reduces the cost, and particularly the degree to which a business might look to get through this particular period by digging into reserves. Reserves means selling when the market is down and changing your position. So that's a very good feature of this. And the standard interest rate for the nonprofits is 2.75%, and up to a term of 30 years. And the funds can be used a little bit more liberally than they can for the PPP. They can be used much more for business debts, because this is a business program. $10,000 is guaranteed with no obligation to repay. So in essence, it's a de facto grant, but I am told the way they're interpreting it, to get $10,000, you'd need 10 employees. If you only had 3 employees, you'd be eligible for $3,000, we think. This is a first-come, first-served program, so it's likely to be exhausted as well, although not exhausted nearly as quickly, I think, as the other program. World Golf Foundation, We Are Golf, certainly all of us, all of Golf's organizations are a part of that, even the USGA, I think. On Monday, I think they are, and on Tuesday, I'm not so sure they are. That's a work in progress as well. Now, that team is continuing to advocate for all of Golf's eligibilities for some of the more generous stimulus programs that'll come in their consideration in the coming weeks. And I put this little note in here about political history and implications for prospects because I have I won't call it an outlier view. I think I have an accurate view. I want you to think long and hard when you think not so much of C6s, and I am disturbed, and I've shared this with Tom Addis, that somehow the sixes weren't pursued independently of the sevens, because the sixes, I think, have a much stronger case for inclusion in the PPP than the sevens do. Keeping in mind, sevens are private clubs. That's not just private golf clubs, that's private yacht clubs, that's the Jonathan Club, that's all the clubs in the United States. Those things which are most passionate about privacy. They are controlled entities. They don't have to follow all the laws that a public access business has to follow, and that includes many of the civil rights laws, a lot of discriminatory laws. So I hope everyone understands, and they are not traditional businesses as let's say a daily fee golf courses, or even a management company doing a municipal golf course. That's a traditional business. They are wide open. They're public entities. They are not private, and they are not able to insulate themselves against all of the laws that apply to things that are open to the public. When I hear that the We Are Golf team is continuing to advocate, and that I've done some investigation, talked to folks in Washington, D.C. to see whether my understanding of what happened with this is correct. And it turns out it was, because it was in the original bill passed by the Senate, all the C chapter corporations, including sixes and sevens, were included. House Democrats and Senate and the 47 senators, Democratic senators in the Senate, simply would not, had all those other C corporations stripped out of it, which is completely consistent with the position that the Democrats in Washington had taken, that because they controlled both houses of Congress and the White House in 2009, and they've been criticized incessantly by their own party and their own base for having put too much of the relief into Wall Street and banks and corporate America, and not enough direct relief into those persons who are more their base as a party, which is middle class, working class, and so forth. Stung by that, very clear. You don't need to be. You can be 3,000 miles away from Washington D.C. and you can see that even the first vote in the Senate for the package was 47 to 40. Was only 47 votes, which meant 6 Republicans didn't go along with the Republican package, and none of the Democrats. This was stripped out intentionally. It was not done in error. I applaud the efforts to try to get it back in, but I may remain skeptical of the possibility. Consequently, I think we should focus, I hope that the industry focuses more on the EIDP and the programs that are already in place, where we don't have to win an argument about the eligibility of C6s and C7s, and maybe can also amend those bills slightly to make them a little bit more generous to meet the crisis. It's just a slight difference. Again, I wish them all the best, and we will see what moves forward. But again, I remain concerned about putting all eggs. Those of you who know me, I don't like posturing. I don't like a firm position which ends up walking away with nothing. I'll take 3 or 4 slices of a loaf, a half a loaf anytime, on behalf of our industry, on behalf of our golf clubs, and on behalf of all of you in the section and all the persons who work in the game. We'll see what happens on that. Finally, a golf hole instead of, dark backgrounds and Capitol buildings and so forth by the ocean. Very pretty. Now I'm going to sort of review what I think is the strategy that all of us have coalesced around in terms of, excuse me, in terms of coming back on board. So very briefly, and this will be repetition for some of you who have been, for many of you who have probably been on all of the 2-section calls that have been twice a week. But here's quickly a closure status landscape. First, I want to reiterate the importance that California, because it's a huge and diverse state geographically and every other way, with 40 million persons and 80 microclimates, Governor Newsom has decided to handle it by his office setting minimum standards and encouraging every local jurisdiction through county boards of supervisors mostly to add to those standards based upon what they think their needs are in terms of controlling the pandemic wave. And that's going to be more acute in urban areas than it is in rural areas, which is one of the reasons, but not the only reason, that today only really in the counties of Sacramento, ironically where the capital is, and San Luis Obispo County is golf permitted to go forward on a basis by permission of the county and a county health officer. In Sacramento, I think that is probably attributed a little bit more to the incredible influence and credibility of the Morton family, which runs the Sacramento municipal system, than it is the conditions that prevail in Sacramento, although for the most part, other than the capital area, it's pretty rural. And San Luis Obispo County had one of those things where there are only, I believe, 10 golf courses in the county, maybe 12. And some of them are municipal and they're open as well. And they just sat down and were able to work some things through with their health officer. Pretty lucky. Now, Monterey County, you may hear there's some golf, and there's a couple of private clubs on a certain basis amounting to open space. So I think Monterey Peninsula Country Club and Cypress Point, to the degree to which they actually have any members in town, everything is shuttered except if a member walks out with clubs, literally walks out with clubs on the property that they own. That public health officer has decided to call that open space. I put down Riverside County because that is the tightest order in the state, not dictated by, I don't think that's dictated by circumstance so much, or even the pandemic curve, and more by the fact that the golf community in particular in the desert got very rambunctious and decided in some cases, in 21 cases anyway, about 20 cases out of the 120, to openly, not just flout the county's directive, but openly do so. And they shifted the debate from the merits of golf's case to practice the social distancing necessary to be an activity that should be permitted, to challenging the government's authority under emergency powers to issue a directive. And that was a critical error, because in a situation where the state authority is literally challenged openly like that, they will always win and you will always lose. And then lost in that is maybe, and there's damage control going on right now. And I'm optimistic about that because this is such a confused time. And I've spoken with another number of GMs, and their position is sort of contrition and let's lay low for a while and see if we can come back into the mix at a somewhat later date. That and the fact that their season is quickly coming to an end may have something to do that. Under the title phase narrative, this is a good way to think about it. And I think it's been an effective way to think about what golf's best strategy is as we move forward. We're in something called phase one, where we have won the arguments about golf being something that could be played under certain conditions of maximal caution, social distancing. And I know we won that debate because right after the governor issued his order, and the counties in Southern California issued much stronger orders, literally on the same day, I was in contact with some of the municipal systems that night. Virtually all of them made a determination. They agreed with all of you on this call who understand this fact, that golf was something uniquely that, well, not uniquely, there are a few other things too, could be played. And they opened their golf courses. And I explained to SCGA's daily fee and private clubs that if the government's issuing the orders, we're interpreting those orders to allow them to open up golf on the golf courses they own. They may not manage all of them, but they own them. They're the owners. Then certainly you're on solid ground doing the same thing. Well, that didn't work out. That lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 days, depending on the jurisdiction. And what really happened was a lot of courses, public and private, just got caught by newspapers and by news teams not practicing what we were preaching in terms of the capacity to practice social distancing. And the public turned on it. And once the public turned on it, the policymakers and the lawmakers had to turn, because that's their God. Elected leaders' God is public opinion. And it was pretty overwhelmingly negative. And it ended up not negative just towards golf, but literally, you know, I live in not far from off of Santa Monica Bay, and I read in the local paper yesterday that over this last weekend, 147 persons were cited for stepping on the beach. That meant alone, not in a group. Phase one is taking draconian steps to stem a pandemic curve so that we don't get in the position of New York City has gotten itself into, and probably a few other cities in America will get themselves into, and that is overtaxing their medical system's ability, literally not enough beds, not enough ventilators, not enough masks, and ultimately under those conditions, there won't be enough doctors and nurses and ER technicians to take care of them. That frightening prospect has caused all thought to go out, all nuance to be left behind, and goal is absolutely to get that curve under control, and that means that we're in practically a lockdown situation, and in Riverside County, even required to wear a mask when you go out in public. You don't have to wear it in your house. There will be a phase two, and a phase three, and a four, and probably even, and ultimately a phase five to this. This is not like an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane in which there is an all clear signal. Suddenly the sun comes back out, the storm is past, the earthquake has happened, and you go up and you clean up and you go back to normal fairly quickly. This is going to be gradual reintroduction of activities. I think golf, because of how we started down the road, maybe we didn't last down that road, but if we can continue to act responsibly, play our cards right, golf should be, can be, and should be among those activities that are reintroduced in phase two very early. There are a lot of things that will never be reintroduced. I mean, I'm told that the Rose Bowl is considering there may be no Rose Bowl game on January 1st, 2021. Now, we're not looking at that. Malls basically are going to stay shuttered for a long period of time. I don't know if the Dodgers will ever play baseball this year, but I can tell you this, golf will come back, along with walking on the beach and various other things at the earliest possible date. I don't know when that is. I would say that California, if you believe the news reports and the early statistics, is doing quite a bit better than a lot of other places. Now, it's been attributed to our stay-in-place orders early. That could be it. Ultimately, minds better than us will analyze all this in a rear view mirror and tell us what happened, and we'll try to learn some lessons. Right now, we're flying blind. But it does appear we should have a little cause for optimism now, as opposed to, let's say, a week or 10 days ago. And golf can and should be part of that. I would say that the organizations have begun coalescing around the notion of a unified best practices, because we don't want to happen in phase two what happened in phase one. We were able to play some golf on some basis, but we didn't really govern it very well, and it got out of hand. We're going to be under obligation to govern it. Now, here's the reality, and I know they made this mistake in Riverside County by leading with the idea that private courses should be indulged in a way that those open to the public, daily fee and municipal, should not. The fact of the matter is that was the wrong approach. Going to lawmakers to draw an invidious distinction between public and private in the state of California is a sure loser as an argument. But what is a winner is a set of high standards. And it's pretty clear that in applying those standards, and I know I spoke with a number of municipal systems in a conference call the other day, they understand that a private country club is probably going to come back on earlier because it can. Not because it's given special dispensation in an ask or a policy, but because it can meet the standard earlier. That is an unequal result based on an equal application of a rule, a law, or a policy, which is different than boldly going out there and making statements that we're private clubs, we should be able to do it, but those public clubs can't do it. Big mistake in California. You're not ever going to get a lawmaker or a policymaker to assent to your ask based on that approach. But you can, but ultimately, as it works out, that's the way it's going to work. And that's going to work that way because of public safety, not because people are drawing invidious distinctions among classes of golf courses or people. There are other phases to this. 3 will be continued integration of activities as the pandemic curve recedes. And some point, there'll be sanction of most business and social activities per small measures of social distancing. If you read what's going on in some countries that have gotten on that other side, whether it's Singapore or Korea, South Korea anyway, you'll see that it isn't an all clear signal, and it's a gradual pullback. Number 5 is when we really literally get back to life, normal life. And I don't know when that'll be, and it may permanently be changed as a result of this, because Mother Nature has reminded us after 100 years that we live on a dangerous planet. Let me put it that way. Okay. I think I've sort of I jumped ahead of my slides, but you get to see the California Alliance for Golf logo on this one anyway, and that looks like a desert shot, and that is a desert shot, not an ocean shot. And we've taken a little criticism about this, but I'm going to explain it. You know, it's to position golf to join similarly situated outdoor recreational activities and being among the first activities reintroduced. I have been blistered by some of the members of SCGA's clubs by suggesting that we actually have much better ability than a park or a beach or a walking trail because we discipline it. Golf is a disciplined social distancing activity. But what they fail to take into account that requires stabbing. That's not just at the park, which is true is not organized or disciplined. And there's a particular sensibility among lawmakers, and I think those who own golf courses because of legal liability, to require employees to expose themselves. And I think that's something that's forgotten by those who look through a very narrow frame and determine that it's safe. Well, in order to keep it that way, you need some staffing, and then I hope everyone gets the picture. And I've already kind of jumped ahead of myself, and I'm known to do that on this sort of phase 2 early reemergence. I think we probably need to coalesce around a set of very strict best practices, which will recede over time. But on sort of the day one, if nothing else, it's a tool to give to all of you and all of us to go to policymakers and lawmakers so they can be assured that we're going to do this. Now, if we do that, we're going to have to live up to it and follow it. Or otherwise, or as it's been stated, as I talked to folks in San Luis Obispo, it's a pretty strict standard. And if they come out and see you're not following it, they'll shut you down. So, things aren't quite as rosy in all those places as they say. And now might not be a bad time to suggest, because I'm sure many of you get the latest from some state somewhere or some jurisdiction somewhere. They're still playing golf and fill in the blank. And oftentimes 3 days later, they're not playing golf and fill in the blank. Or they're not playing golf universally. They're in a similar situation like Colorado, where I don't know where they stand right now, but even when I heard Colorado's governor permits it, but much of the substantial portion of the state was shut down for other reasons because localities intervened and went with higher standards. So maybe in the middle of nowhere, it was easy to practice, but in Denver, I can tell you that a lot of the public systems closed down almost at the same time California did, even though they could have stayed open, and that was probably the case here as well. As we get beyond COVID-19, and I've taken, like a lot of you, to using the phrase, before the world changed, we're in uncharted waters. There's another hackneyed phrase that we all hear. We know that have taken an enormous economic hit. We know that some sectors are not going to come back. Golf is certainly going to come back. How much of it comes back remains to be seen. How deep the recession is or how long. Again, I pore over the Wall Street Journal. I try to every day anyway, and it would appear that that more of the economists think that this recession will be more like a V, a sudden descent down, a U, and a not a particularly steep ascent out. But you get the two economists in the room, you get three opinions, so we don't know what is going to happen. But we know that there are going to be long-term effects. There are going to be tremendous implications for the games institutions and institutional arrangements. If you're like me, I had a lot of good projects going and wonderful ideas going, and I know even at the SCGA, we were so pleased at the beginning of the year as we were showing year-over-year growth for 2 years in a row. Not great growth, but some growth, which is nice after a period of some decline. And we had a lot of programs in place, and Kevin Fitzgerald and I worked in municipal systems and had all kinds of good reforms going and positive things working. And just as the days go by, you realize all that's done. We're just going to try to scramble back and see what we can, make of things. 16 million unemployment. I think the biggest number during the Great Recession in any 1 week was something like 300,000 or 400,000. So consider the magnitude of that as you move forward, and I think it's going to be impactful. I think ultimately, because it's an outdoor activity, golf will come back earlier, but there's no way everyone is going to get hit by this. Of course, we'll recover eventually, we always do, but I think there are some particular dangers longer term for golf because of things that were in play before the world changed. And I'm thinking mostly in the urban areas in California where golf's been under some attack, literally for its legitimacy in using 100+ acres of land when we're in so dire need of housing and other things. Now, there are California laws, like the California Park Protection Act, which insulate us against the worst of that, but laws can be changed. And things like pandemics and deep recessions are the kinds of things that stimulate major change. So I think we need to be on alert, and we need to, as we move forward, keep in mind that I know on this call, I have in this conversation focused so deeply on economic issues, on relief issues, stimulus issues, business issues, properly so. But we're probably better in the public realm to focus on the value of the game to our communities and the value of the game to younger generations and so forth. And I don't necessarily mean in just the sort of traditional first tee way, but in a much deeper way that we haven't done in the past, and probably begin to focus again on the reasons that all that land was dedicated towards golf in the first place. Because we've allowed that, we've let others define us for their needs and not necessarily for ours. So we're probably going to have to ramp those things up, and also recognize that just as we have discovered that, I'm not going to just pick on the federal government. I'm going to pick on California as well, because California had a pretty good plan in place coming out of the swine flu problem back in 2005, 2006, 2007, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor. He put in some pretty good fail-safe mechanisms. He felt that the institutions in California were not strong enough to deal with that. We got a little bit lucky. That didn't turn out to be that bad. We're not lucky this time. And he put some programs in place. And when we got to the Great Recession, 2010, 2011, we cut those programs out. Now, as we went out of the recession and built up all those surpluses, and it turns out that public health officials clamored to reinstitute those programs, we just didn't do it. So we hit this moment as unprepared as the federal government hit this moment, unprepared. And as a result, we're probably, as everyone understands, we have more COVID-19 cases than anyone in the world. We will have more of those and more deaths than anybody. And we will have an economic downturn worse than it could have been or should have been based upon that unpreparedness. I hope golf learns a very narrow lesson, not one that's life and death like that lesson is, but in terms of the institutions it has. When we arrive at moments like this, if we don't have something in place to protect our interests and advance them better than we have now, you get what you get. So I hope as this recedes and things come back, we remember that there's an element in that preparedness lesson for golf as well. And in this case, it's more of an institutional preparedness, because we are still despite, I feel sorry for other parts of the country, because there's little doubt in my mind that in California, Southern California in particularly, golf's institutions work in unison and work together better than anywhere else in this nation. And yet it's not quite good enough to meet these kinds of challenges. We need to do better, maybe not in terms of the cooperation, but maybe in terms of having put resources behind that cooperation. It requires that as well. I apologize. I couldn't get through a presentation with this particular audience without getting that particular message in there. Now I have actually, I know there was an over/under on whether I could, stay focused enough to stick with those slides and leave enough time for some questions. And I hope there are some questions, because then I'll probably subject you to another, I'll probably get up on the soapbox again and give another sermon. So, John, have you?
Mr. Kessler, you get on that soapbox whenever you wish. I was one of the ones that had the under. I thought you weren't going to get past the second slide. When you told me that you had as many slides as you had yesterday, I was like, wow, historically, in a Craig Kessler presentation on a catalyst, you don't have any more than 4 slides, and we don't get past the second one. But, every time you come on the catalyst, especially now in this environment, I'm just overwhelmed with information, and I come away with more off of your catalyst than I do with most. No offense to others, but thank you very much, Craig. There are a barrage of questions that have come in. First question, SBA loan question. If you've been injured and are collecting payments from SDI, state disability insurance, can you still apply for an SBA loan?
Here's my answer to that. That is a really good question for an employment lawyer or someone who specializes it. I think so, but my thinking so is not a very definitive answer. And you know what? That may be one of those things where even reminds me of AB 5 after it passed, and I had conversations with some really accomplished employment lawyers, and 30 minutes into every conversation, I had to tell them that I'm so happy they were as confused as I was, because it meant I wasn't stupid. It was just a confusing question. So that may end up being there as well. But I would direct you, and I would also encourage, I know it's almost impossible to get through to these agencies right now, but that's really a question for them, because ultimately there may not be a right or wrong answer, but just an answer that a governmental agency gives you when going over your claim. But at this particular time, the only thing I'm recommending is there's no harm in asking and applying in this particular time. You'll not be punished for overloading the system with claims, because we're just in one of those moments of emergency, and you'll be forgiven. So go ahead and go for it. I don't guarantee anything, but go for it.
Well, the second part of that question is, can you again tell us if and how the loan can be forgiven? I guess it's the same answer, right?
Yeah, the terms of that are that and again, those are sole proprietors as well. Under the PPP, if you provide documentation that you use those monies basically to keep your staffing intact, and you can pay certain business expenses as well, which is part of that. That is really the underlying aim of that half of the relief. The other half's a little bit different, which is why it's less generous, and it's a little bit geared towards a certain kind of nonprofit, which are not businesses, and for larger businesses, which have more capacity to absorb debt absorb problems during this time. It's all geared, everything philosophically. Not all the rules have been issued, but if you spend that on maintaining a payroll while you're closed down, that's that's the gold standard of forgiveness.
Can the California Alliance for Golf come up with a list of best practices as they lobby to have golf reintroduced during the particularly the phase 2 of the reintroduction?
The answer is yes. It's working on it. Obviously, there'll be broad deference to the Golf Course Superintendents Association because many of those practices are out on the golf course. But it'll again, there are persons, and we'll take in the advice of those who are expert in operations. But the answer is yes.
Now, in sort of a selfish question here, in terms of Riverside County and the June 19th closure mandate that kind of coincides with when schools are getting out. Of course, when we talked earlier, I really liked how you alluded to that being similar to a person getting pulled over doing 90 in a 45, and when the police officer comes up to the car and says, hey, you were doing 90 in a 45. Well, it's because I don't agree with the speed limit being 45. I think it should be 90, and then speeding off and going 90 again. Of course, that's going to agitate the police officer tremendously. And you had made that allusion to what had happened here in Riverside County. Do you think if other counties open earlier, such as LA, Orange, San Diego, do you think that Riverside will open along with them, or do you think as retaliation or punishment that Riverside will stay till June 19th because of what took place with the 20 clubs?
No, I'm very optimistic on that count. I think Riverside responded the way it did. I mean, there's no doubt if you read the press release, it was to spank the golf industry. But now the golf, was to get the golf industry to comply with the orders. Once that happens, I believe, and particularly we'll have some dialogues with Supervisor Manny Perez, who represents the desert. I mean, these are his constituents, and I think he will, I think calmer heads will prevail, and things will be done on facts and science. Riverside County has a very good health director. He's a tough one, so I think we'll go on the facts and the science. And certainly, if LA County thinks social distancing can be done on the golf courses in the middle of the second largest city in the country, I think in particular Riverside County can comply, particularly the desert, which strikes me it's going to be a much easier task to enforce than a municipal course in the middle of LA. That's going to be a little bit more difficult, and I know they're talking about extended tee intervals and all kinds of practices which are going to limit access and revenue. And that's going to be, when the sun comes out and the all clear sort of people can get back to playing golf, they're going to be pretty antsy and pretty angry. So it'll, I think everything will be okay.
Craig, I've got one here from Robin Shelton. Craig, you mentioned about people being cited on a beach in LA. How many people did he say were cited over what period of time?
I think it was last weekend. I mean, I could be a little off on the numbers, and it was in a newspaper, so it may come as a shock to some of you. Sometimes newspapers get things wrong, so I'm letting you know what the source is. It was something like 147 persons, literally, because those beaches are shut down, as are the access points into the Santa Monica Mountains. So if you get past those things, you have to really work to get past the barriers. But if you do, you'll be cited. And I think it was 147 persons along the beaches south of LAX were cited over the weekend for breaking through those barriers. Now, I'm going to guess that it was one person probably, or two, 50 feet apart, that were doing it. And yet, I mention this to emphasize to those of you who think that the decision to automatically close all golf was unfair. You're right. And you're absolutely right. And then I would also state that that's the case of, I mean, can you imagine walking alone on the beach? I'm not sure. Today's not a great beach day, but I just look at this, and we're under the emergency powers. The counties are given the ability to err on the side of a lot of things. And when you keep in mind, particularly to that notion, the government has literally shut down businesses, thus the PPP. And in other words, told persons who own businesses, whose livelihoods are invested in those businesses, you can't open them up and conduct commerce. So put that all in perspective, and put in perspective that the reason for all of this is not arbitrary, invocation of governmental powers. It's to get control of something so that a lot of people don't die as a result of overtaxing the medical system. With this virus, people are going to die anyway, no matter under the best of circumstances. And we want to make sure that it is the best of circumstances and not the worst. It's an emergency moment. It's not business as usual. And again, there's something, if you think about it for a moment, you're a policymaker, a member of a board of supervisors, city council, you're the governor of California. And this is what you're facing. You're the persons responsible for not getting us to the point of literally having no hospital beds and no ventilators and no masks and no doctors and no technicians and no nurses to handle this. And someone comes and says, I should be able to play golf. Now, it's probably true they should be able to play golf. But do you really think it's going to be well received in an atmosphere like that, particularly because the reason for it isn't punitive. It's the sense that I have to shut everything down, because once you begin tolerating A or B or C or D on the specifics, and golf's in those specifics. That's why I tell everybody who wants to send me nasty emails, golf this, I say, you're absolutely right. Every argument is correct. We made it, we won it, and then it didn't hold. Hold on to that thought. There's more golf to be had on the other side of the curve than there is for another extra day or two on this side of it. And there's some bad publicity, and there's some bad public relations on this side of it as well. So put that sort of thing into perspective. And that's often the hardest thing for persons to do, because they know what their position is, they know what their life is, they know what serves their interest, and they forget that as they step out into the public arena, there are 8 billion other competing interests. And in this case, the big competing interest is policymakers who simply don't want to have anyone look back and say, had you been, and there are going to be places in this country that have not done what California has done, and they may get into some big trouble, and we'll see what happens. But anyway, that's sort of that's my plea to everyone here, is that sometimes you can be right on every point, but it isn't going to make any difference.
We had a section board of directors meeting for the SCPGA yesterday morning, and there were some comments made, and I want to know if you know how true they are in terms of clubs that are allowing play under they're closed, but they're not enforcing people going out there, in terms of the city and the county shutting off water and power, particularly Riverside County.
I've not heard it. There have been threats in the city of Los Angeles. I know the mayor has threatened, not on golf courses because none are open. None is open, but it's certain businesses that have defied it, that's a tool they would use. Now, I can say that what they're thinking of is what I described in Monterey County, where that health director has ruled that in an equity private club, those who own it, and only those who own it, in other words, members, if everything else is shuttered and no staff is permitted except the maintenance staff in the morning, I guess, to cut the greens, no flag sticks, no holes, no nothing. If they step on, they've ruled that, and then you take a golf bag and walk and hit a few shots to a golf course that's really not open and not prepared, that in essence, that's open space activity by people who own the space. But that's what Monterey County ruled, and the golf courses were able to get that indulgence from the health director. That indulgence, I believe, was sought by certain desert private clubs that probably could do the same thing as a couple of Monterey private clubs. And that health director said no. So whether one director is right and one director is wrong is I don't know, is inconsequential because that director in Riverside County had the legal authority to do what he did, and he did it. And for those who don't understand how county government works, he had the blessing of the Board of Supervisors and the CEO in doing that. So that's sort of my best answer to it moving forward.
And final question, do you know if the 600 in additional stimulus monies applies directly to EDD monies, or is it separate?
Good question. I know the right to it is separate and the source is separate. And I don't, again, even California EDD probably, I have to dig into it because they say the checks are flowing in New York and Illinois. Are they flowing directly independent of the state? I don't know. They may be, again, I don't know. Because I just don't know. I hope so. It's hard to know because none of it's flowed in California yet.
Okay, Craig, thank you very much for your time and your expertise and your preparation today on the Catalyst webinar. You've done this many times, and I think this Catalyst in particular probably has more resonance, more significance, and certainly more relevant. There's nothing more relevant than this right now. And on behalf of the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA, thank you very, very much for being with us this morning. For all the PGA members that are on this morning's webinar, as usual, coming from my email, there will be the YouTube recording of Craig's presentation this morning, along with a link to the Catalyst quiz. When you get that email here in the next hour or so, please take the quiz. Feel free to refer to the YouTube recording and submit the quiz once you're completed. A score of 70% on the quiz will earn 1 MSR credit for attending this morning's Catalyst. In light of the course closures and the charged atmosphere, the Catalyst webinar series typically is every other Thursday, working with Tom Addis and Nikki Gatch and Jeff Johnson at the section office. We are adding Catalyst to every Thursday until this pandemic is over. So we've got the boys from Blast Motion that are going to be on the Catalyst next Thursday, and the following Thursday after that, we will have Tim Campbell, Mike Aldridge, and Peyton Randolph with Iconic Golf that are going to be presenting on April 23rd. So once again, thank you, everybody. Be safe, be sane, take care. Thank you for being on the Catalyst. Thanks for supporting the Catalyst. Mr. Kessler, thank you for your time this morning. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.